Thanks, Matt. Thanks to the Institute. Thanks to the Campus Conservatives for having me today. As Matt said, it's always fun to be here. I've actually spoken in this room before, so this is like old home a little bit. My first question today is, how many of you have seen House of Cards? Raise your hand. All right, good. Okay, almost everybody. Okay, well, I'll do my first part really quickly. Let me be clear, though, about what I want to do today. What this is really an introduction to public choice theory, as illustrated through examples from House of Cards. So what I really want to do is introduce you to public choice theory in this particular way that economists look at the political process, and that's the politics without romance. And what I'm going to do is do that and then give you as many examples as I can, at least from the first season of House of Cards. Just in case anyone hasn't seen the second. First season examples to sort of illustrate that and sort of show how House of Cards, I think, does a really nice job in though without ever saying it, presenting a number of these ideas that public choice economists, public choice theorists would agree with or would see. So House of Cards, again, just for maybe the handful of you who haven't seen it, it's the story of U.S. Representative Frank Underwood and his climb to power and revenge-taking after being passed over for Secretary of State. Along the way, we see all kinds of ugly politics. Naked self-interest, favor trading, extortion, manipulation, cronyism, and yes, even murder. One question from the start you might ask, or we might ask, is the show pure cynicism? Politicians aren't really like that, are they? It's hard to agree, perhaps, in a world where one American politician closed lanes on a bridge to piss off his opponent. It's hard to agree when another American president appears to be using the IRS to punish his political opponents. And since the first time I gave this talk was in the U.S., it's even better now I get to say, not to mention Rob Ford. Anything, after Rob Ford, anything a politician does is now officially believable. Okay? And, of course, in the last few years, we've seen rampant crony capitalism and all these kinds of things. And polls report, at least U.S. data that I've seen, that people are more cynical about government, about politics, than ever before. Okay? So that's part of this. Another question you might ask, you might think about as we go on this evening is this, are these bad politicians a bug or a feature? Right? I mean, and what I mean by that is it just a matter that people choose bad leaders? Or is there something structural about politics that inevitably produces the kinds of things that we see on display throughout House of Cards? That's a question maybe to frame the whole talk. Okay? And what I'm going to do is, as I've said, I'm going to explore the workings of the political process by way of what's known as the economic theory of politics, or also known as public choice theory. Okay? And public choice theory gives us a way of understanding the world that the world of House of Cards is not the exception, but more the rule. It helps us understand why that's the case. Why is House of Cards actually quite realistic? How many of you have seen the American series West Wing? Have you ever seen West Wing? House of Cards is like the anti-West Wing, right? West Wing was this very, I'm going to use this word again, romanticized vision of politics, and House of Cards is everything West Wing wasn't. Frank Underwood's character, especially as the second season goes on, might be a particularly outlandish example of what politics can do to people, but once again, in a world of Rob Ford, anything is possible. But it might just be a matter of degree. All the things that Frank and all the other characters in House of Cards do can be made intelligible. We can understand it with a good dose of public choice theory. And more generally, public choice theory sheds light on any number of political phenomena that often seem to be bizarre or unexplainable. So we'll look at some examples from House of Cards, but we'll talk about some other kinds of things as well. So where do we start? We can start by saying a few things about public choice theory. As I suggested, public choice theory starts by kind of rejecting the romantic vision of politics. It's a response to that romantic vision, and particularly the way that romantic vision played out in the discipline of economics. So what do we mean by the romantic vision of politics? The idea that politics is this sort of arena of virtue, or a place where people debate the public interest and then go about doing the things that enact that public interest. That is, that politicians figure out what the best thing to do is. They can know that, they can learn it, they can figure it out, and then they actually go ahead and do it. It's the idea of politics as being a noble calling to improve the lives of other people. These are all the ways we might think about what we mean by the romantic vision of politics. The question, however, is this in fact, empirically, how the political process works? That is, does it really do this? We can wish that politics might look like that romantic vision, but wishing doesn't make it so, right? Just because we might wish it doesn't mean that's actually how it works. Okay? And the problem with the romantic vision is that it obscures three things, okay? Actually four, okay, but three and then the fourth that's connected. One of the things that that romantic vision obscures is the power of incentives. It blinds us to the real incentives that face political actors and how those incentives affect the choices that they make. That vision, that romantic vision, also obscures the irrelevance of intentions. And what I mean by that is we frequently tend to judge politicians and other political actors by their intentions. How good are their intentions? Did they mean well? Okay? And one of the things I want to talk about is no matter how, they may or may not mean well, but meaning well isn't enough. We need to understand how even good intentions can turn into bad consequences. It also obscures the importance of who has what information. This is something I'm going to talk about less tonight, but if you're interested and you have read a little bit of the sort of classical liberal ideas, you've probably come across this sort of argument that says that it's difficult for political actors to know all the things that they need to know in ways that enable them to enact that public interest, that romantic vision of politics. And finally, it obscures the role of institutions in understanding these 3 points. And what I mean by that is it matters how the political process is set up to determine whether or not people have the right information and the right incentives, whether their intentions are irrelevant in the sense that even people with bad intentions, right, if they have the right rules of the game, the right institutions, even people with bad intentions can do good things. It may be the case that Steve Jobs is the greediest guy ever in the history of the world, right? But that's okay, because if you got your iPhone working right now, right, his greed generated good consequences for you. So what matters here, and we'll see this with politics in particular, is how intentions turn into consequences depends upon those institutions, depends upon those rules of the game, depends upon the structure within which people act. And one of the problems is that the romantic view of politics assumes that politicians are generally altruistic, but that people in the market are generally self-interested. I'm going to come back to that point a little later and stress how important that assumption is and whether that's an assumption that we really want to keep. Okay? The other thing that we need to see to understand public choice theory is what I like to call the ipso facto leap. Right? And ipso facto simply means because of this, therefore that. Okay? If this is true, that must be true. So what's the ipso facto leap here? Well, you have to know a little bit of some history of economic thought for a moment. Okay? Historically, the standard case for government intervention in the market, the standard argument that government should step in and improve on market outcomes, went something like the following. We have some idealized picture of how markets would work. The reality of markets did not live up to that optimal outcome. Therefore, government should step in and take whatever steps are necessary to fix that to meet the optimum. Okay? So anytime markets fell short of the optimum, government should step in and improve on those outcomes. How many of you are econ majors or minors? So if you are, you've probably heard this story before, and maybe if you're in politics, government, political science major, you have. All right? I mean, historically, one example of this was, say, pollution, right? The idea was that if you had private market actors polluting, that led to a suboptimal outcome. How did you fix it? Well, you said the government, go in, tax the producers, the polluters, take some of the taxes you raise in the polluters, transfer that money to the people who are being harmed by the pollution, and you can resolve the problem, right? Sounds great. I can draw it up on a blackboard even and show you, and it looks beautiful. Right? The question, however, is this how it actually works? And more specifically, people did not subject the political process to the same sort of analysis. Notice the economic analysis says, here's this beautiful vision of how markets work perfectly. When markets don't, in fact, work the way we say they do in theory, therefore government should step in. That's the ipso facto. But what people didn't ask is, well, wait a second. Can government do what we say it should do? One of my favorite ways to get this point across is the story of the singing contest. Okay? Here's the story of the singing contest. There was a king once who decided he needed a new official court singer. It's kind of like American or Canadian Idol, right? He sent out his staff throughout the kingdom and tried to audition people to see if they wanted to become the next court singer. And his staff got it down to 2 people. And those 2 people were brought into the castle, you know, to the king, front of the king, and they were told to sing for the king. The first one gets up and sings for the king, and when the first one's done, the king says, "That's the worst singing I've ever heard in my life," and immediately makes the second one into his court singer. Now, what's the problem with that story? Why is that not necessarily a wonder?
He doesn't know how well the other person sings.
Right, and so what might be the case?
They could be worse.
They could be worse, right? They could be worse, okay? And I like this little story because it reminds us that what we should be doing is comparative political economy. We can't just look at one thing, declare it insufficient, and then say, let's do the other. We actually have to look at both and compare them. We need to hear both singers sing so we know which one's better. Just because one isn't great doesn't mean the other one is worse. And so when we think about the relationship between government and the economy, this is the very same question we have to ask, which is just because markets don't work perfectly, and I'm a guy who loves markets, I think they're awesome, but they don't work perfectly. They're full of problems. But that doesn't necessarily mean government can fix them. And that's when we have to ask the question, what in fact can government do? Falling short of perfection is not grounds for condemnation, necessarily. We need to ask if things are better or worse, not whether they are ideal, not whether they are perfect. And this basic sort of framework that I've given you is how public choice theory does what it does. I'm going to give you 4 names to know. If you don't know these names, you should. James Buchanan, who won the Nobel Prize in 1986, just passed away this past January. This or last January? Maybe last January. Anyway,
You're right, what's last January?
yeah, last January, a year ago January. James Buchanan, his frequent writing partner Gordon Tullock, Mansur Olson, Bill Niskanen, are 4 names. There's other names I can mention here too. Are 4 of the sort of key thinkers in this public choice tradition. And these guys started arguing in the 1950s and 1960s, making the kinds of arguments that I just made, that I'm going to continue to make in just a moment, about how politics actually works. And one of the key assumptions, and this is one particularly connected with Buchanan, is the idea of what we might call behavioral symmetry. And this goes back to this idea that the fundamental problem is that historically people assumed that market actors, entrepreneurs, and producers were self-interested, while political actors were more altruistic. Right? Making that different assumption is a problem. Right? What do people suddenly change? Does the same person who's greedy in the marketplace then go into politics and suddenly become purely altruistic? Right? Isn't it more the case that people are people? And in fact, what public choice theory did was to assume that people are motivated in the same ways in politics and economics. Whatever you want to assume about one, you should assume about the other. You want to assume they're altruistic in both, that's great. You want to assume they're self-interested in both, that's fine too. But make the same assumption in both. Treat both of them the same way. That's behavioral symmetry. We should see symmetrical behavior between the 2 realms. Okay? And that, once you start to think about politics that way, and in general what the public choice theorists did was to assume people are broadly self-interested in both. Not narrowly, not sort of super narrow greedy, but broadly self-interested. What people are interested in is improving their lives through exchange. Okay? So here's our friend Stamper, right? Sometimes for my job I have to put fear in other people. Okay? This is a political actor saying that. You might also have heard that come out of the mouth of an entrepreneur, right, or a business person. Again, make the same assumption in both realms. Once we do this, once we start thinking about people this way, then politics begins to look a little bit different. One of the things we begin to recognize that in politics, everyone wants something. Just like in the market, right? You go out, I wanted something to drink for my talk. I would have preferred bottled water, but apparently that's illegal on this campus. just makes me want to like take bottles and go fill them up with water. I'll tell you quickly, my campus, you can still, I think, get bottled water, but maybe not anymore. But we got rid of it. You probably have done it here if you don't have bottled water. We got rid of the trays at the dining hall because the argument was there people were taking too much food and wasting all this food by putting it on trays. Now you watch people trying to juggle right for things and spilling it all over the place, right? And people have to put lids and covers on everything, which, by the way, you might not have noticed, get thrown out. It's like, so there's no winning. Anyway, everybody wants something, okay? What do politicians want? They want votes, they want power, okay? We see that in House of Cards all over the place. Frank will do pretty much anything to keep his constituents happy. If you remember the episode where he runs down to South Carolina, right? There's that big dispute over the land, right? And he tries to mediate, the girl who was killed, right? Trying to mediate with the parents and all that. Bureaucrats, what do? They want power, they want dollars, they want budgets, right? They want the ability to do the things that they need to do. There's a third group. Voters. What do voters want? We like government benefits in general, right? Most voters want government to do things for them. They also would like to keep taxes. I said no taxes, maybe I'm dreaming, but at least they want taxes low, right? They want the benefits. They don't want to have to pay any more for them than they absolutely need to. Okay? All of these actors are seekers of something, just like firms in the market are profit seekers. So when we think about politics, we recognize that people are out after these things. So just for the moment, right, we might consider some examples from House of Cards. I mentioned a couple, but certainly the entire premise of the show is Frank's attempt to climb, at least first, to the vice president's job after being passed over for Secretary of State. When in the series does Frank show much, if any, concern for anyone but himself, or perhaps Claire? But even there, right, that's Bill and Hillary, right? That's an interesting relationship. It is. Okay. More generally, how often do any of the characters, especially the elected officials in this series, ever speak of the public interest in a way that makes you believe they mean it? Right? They will use it, but it's usually a prop, right? It's usually a way to appeal to voters or whatever the case may be. The other interesting thing I think, and to me this is one of the reasons the show is so well written. Notice how Frank can understand Claire and Remy the lobbyist and his fellow congressmen. All of Frank's plans depend upon his assumption, Frank's assumption, that these people are in it just for themselves, just like he is. Right? That's the whole clever part of this, is that Frank comes across as being the most self-interested character, but the reason he's able to do that is because he assumes everyone else is just like he is, and they mostly are. His entire manipulation of Rousseau in the first season depends on Rousseau being so driven that Rousseau wants to climb the ladder. Right? Rousseau's self-interest is what enables Frank to manipulate him. If you remember in the first season, they write the education bill, right? And Frank's involved in that. And there's Frank trying to mediate the self-interest of the politicians, including Frank's desire to get at least some credit for it, along with the teachers' union and their desire to get their share of things, right? And so his whole role there is to mediate all that self-interest. And by the way, it's worth noting, you remember the great sequence about how that bill was written, where Frank locks the 10, I call them kids, right? The 10 staffers in the room and says, don't come out until you have the bill, and like they're in there living on coffee and cold pizza for a week, and it stinks in there, right? Okay? I mean, that's how legislation gets made. If you know the old Saturday morning, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill, right? You grew up in the States, you couldn't miss this, right? Was this very romanticized vision of how law gets made. And the 10 staffers in the room with cold pizza and coffee is a much more realistic version of how it happens. Even Rousseau's silence in the testimony on the shipyards, which enrages his constituents, enrages them precisely because they expect him to deliver the goods for them. They're his constituent self-interest. The point is not that political actors are sort of way worse than other people. Political actors in House of Cards are actually no more or less self-interested than your typical business person in a TV drama. That's what's awesome about this show. It's not West Wing, okay? And it's not evil business people being portrayed as evil in some other drama. It's political actors doing those same sorts of things. In that way, it has more realism to it, and it lines a little better with the kinds of things we see when we talk about public choice theory. Okay? What all of this suggests is when we analyze the political process, okay, we should be much more concerned with the consequences of people's choices than the motivations behind those choices. Once we go with behavioral symmetry, once we recognize that people are motivated by the same things in both arenas, then we take motivation out of the picture. We can't say politics is better than the market because people are more saintly in politics, right? No, okay. But we also can't say that markets are better because entrepreneurs are more saintly or smarter or anything else than political actors. It's got to be something about the structure of those institutions and those arenas of interaction that lead to these different results. So one way to frame this is this way. The question is not so much whether politics or markets or politics have better people in it, or even whether we can change those people. The point is, given human propensity, which system structure of institutions works better to generate good outcomes? Put another way, under what set of rules and what institutions will bad people do the least harm? You see what Frank and Stamper, right, do in House of Cards with that power. The question is, when we think about markets, right, how much, under those institutions, how much harm can bad people do? And that's the interesting way to think about the question. Okay, so with that in mind, let's say a little bit more about politics as exchange. Right? We can start, here's, politicians shaking hands is usually a sign that something bad is happening. Because they have just conducted some sort of deal. And who's not at that table? You and me. So if we think about politics as exchange, what we recognize is that politics, like markets, is a process by which people exchange to make themselves better off. That's what people are doing within the political process. Once we begin to look at politicians this way, right, we can see that exchange is what's happening here. Right? It also helps us understand a bunch of things that are happening in the marketplace. One of them being lobbying. And the reporter for the paper who did the interview with me asked me who my favorite House of Cards character was. And I immediately said Remy. Okay? And Remy, and I'm going to come back and talk a little bit more about Remy later, but Remy represents so much of the truth behind what's happening in House of Cards. What we need to recognize here, of course, is that what we're seeing happen in politics is a process of wealth transfer through exchange, but not wealth creation. And this is an important difference between markets and politics. The exchanges that take place in markets tend to create wealth. The ones that take place in politics tend to simply transfer it. Political actors are taking the wealth created by the market and moving it around from one place to another. And not just moving it around, but moving it around in ways that actually involve waste and loss and so on. The most important question to ask when you see politicians talking about some kind of proposal or some new thing they want to do is cui bono, who benefits? Right? Who's going to benefit from this? Because politicians know that if they're going to do something, they got to benefit from it too. And it's worth asking, are they benefiting? Are there private sector actors who are benefiting from it? I understand, I don't know what the latest is, but I understand Uber is a big topic in Ottawa. Okay? My daughter, a freshman at NYU, took her first Uber ride a couple weeks ago in New York City. So people are saying, oh, we can't have Uber in Ottawa because, and perhaps they're saying, and I haven't followed it closely, perhaps saying, well, these drivers aren't licensed, they're unsafe. And the first question you ask is, who's benefiting from this argument? And who's normally making the argument that Uber drivers are not safe? Taxi company. Shocking, isn't it, right? And by the way, have you ever been in has every cab driver you've ever had been the safest driver you've ever been? Especially, depends on the city, but yeah. Okay, so again, who benefits, right? It sounds like a public interest argument, but the first thing we ask is, well, wait a second, who's got things at stake here? And is there self-interest at stake? And that's, I think, again, part of the question worth asking. And so when we begin to think about it this way, we begin to see this point earlier, that politicians, what do they want? Votes and power, bureaucrats want budgets and power, right? Voters want programs and low taxes. And then we can begin to see the trades that take place here. Okay? We can begin to see how voters trade with politicians. I'll vote for your program, you keep my taxes low. Right? Think about how politicians appeal to their constituents. You guys are too young to remember Walter Mondale, who ran for president in 1940 in the United States. But Mondale, in his campaign, said, I'm courageous enough to tell you that I'm going to raise taxes when I'm elected. Did you get elected? Not too many politicians can get away with that. And nor can politicians say, oh, by the way, if you elect me, I'm going to cut spending on whatever it is in your district, right, that you really like, because I think it's wasteful. Right? So politicians know what they have to do. Politicians trade with bureaucrats, right? Politicians say to bureaucrats, I'll keep funding your program or your department. The bureaucrats in turn have to support the politicians by saying, either by voting for them, perhaps in their role as voters, but by making the case for why this program is so important. And voters trade with bureaucrats, at least indirectly, right? Voters can provide support for bureaucrats by thinking that certain programs are good kinds of things, and bureaucrats, by spending lavishly and by expanding their budgets and power, can benefit voters or give voters the things that they want. So again, who benefits and how is the question here. And one of the key concepts is the idea of what we call rent seeking. Right? And what we mean by rent seeking is the attempt to obtain a political privilege. Now that political privilege might be a privilege that enhances your profits. It might be one that penalizes your competition. So Uber, or the Ottawa taxi cab drivers, trying to persuade the city council to ban Uber is a form of rent seeking. They're trying to obtain, or at least maintain, a political privilege, being the only licensed cab operators in the city, okay? And that it's their profit at stake, and by shutting out the competition this way, right? But you can think of tons of examples. Almost all the lobbying you see happening around you in this wonderful city, right, is about this kind of rent, what we call rent seeking. The word rent here, don't confuse this with the rent that you pay for an apartment or on land. It comes, the history of the economics is interesting, and I can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. It comes from the same sort of place, but the idea of what rent here simply means is the monopoly gain, the profit you get from having a particular asset. So the fact that Ottawa cab drivers can earn higher fares because they can shut out the competition from Uber or Lyft or whomever is a rent. It's a return to their having this particular political privilege. If you want to think in terms of House of Cards, right, you can think about monopolies or new regulations. You can think about the shipyards bill and how people were lobbying for that one way or the other. You can think about the education bill, how people were lobbying there. All of that is this kind of rent seeking. It covers all of this lobbying and cronyism and all this other activity that we see. When governments distribute benefits, particularly when they give out something that's a kind of monopoly privilege, you can bet that people will expend resources to get it. Historically, when economists said, what's wrong with monopolies? What we said was, well, the problem with monopolies is it leads to firms restricting their output and selling it at a higher price, and that meant that producers got more than consumers did, but more importantly, by restricting their output, that monopolies would restrict output, it meant that fewer exchanges would take place, exchanges that sort of should take place, but would take place if there was competition, but didn't because there was monopoly. What the rent-seeking view says, well, no, those are not the only cost of monopoly, right? The costs of monopoly also include all the resources people expend in attempting to obtain that monopoly. So all the work people do, all the lobbying people do, all the lunches they buy, all the limos they hire, all the time they spend in MPs' offices, all these kinds of things, right, are the part of the cost of monopoly. If the government wasn't giving out that privilege in the first place, we wouldn't have all that activity. And this helps us understand the real costs of government, right? The real costs of government are not just the waste of the particular policy, but all of this lobbying and energy and activity that goes into deciding who's going to get what. If government didn't have those powers and weren't giving out those privileges, the people who do all that work could do something else for a living that actually might improve our lives in more substantive ways. It's wasted resources. If you want to think of an analogy here, okay, what's the cost of living in a high crime area? If you live in a part of, let's say, New York City that's high crime, okay, certainly part of the cost is the fact that you might get robbed, okay, and you might lose some of your wealth if you're robbed or your apartment's broken into or something like that. But there's another cost to it. How many of you are Seinfeld fans? Seinfeld. Imagine, visualize Seinfeld's door for a second, okay? Kramer hasn't come through yet. So, what's on that door? Locks, like several. What else does Seinfeld have in that apartment, remember? George, buzz me in, okay? So he's got all this investment in anti-crime. part of the cost of living in a high crime area is not just that you might get robbed, but that you have to devote resources to protecting yourself. I live in a 7,000 person town, right? My door has one little knob on it. You almost never hear a car alarm go off in my town. Two reasons. One, crime rate's so low, people don't invest in car alarms. Second, if you see the cars people drive, nobody wants to steal them anyway. Right? And when you do hear one go off, it's almost always a student's car, because they drive better cars than that. So the costs here are the investments we make. If you think about an area like mine with very little crime, all the resources I would have to spend on preventing crime, I can now spend on large screen TVs and whatever else that I want. When government gets in the business of providing benefits to specific groups, you can bet that all kinds of people will be willing to spend resources to acquire those particular benefits. Right? If having a monopoly would give you $10 million in profits, people will want to spend close to $10 million to try to get it. And frequently, whichever side can spend the most resources rent-seeking, that is, can spend the most resources on lobbying, will carry the day politically, even if that outcome is not socially best. Even cases where motives may seem to be pure, the reality might be that it's about people's self-interest and who is able to spend the most money persuading someone else to pass this bill. And once you begin to see how much that matters, you begin to see that we can't assume that the outcomes of the political process are necessarily the public interest. They may be the outcomes of this ongoing exchange process. Lots of examples from House of Cards, the whole plot line about ScanCorp, right, and its attempts to influence Congress and the White House, the Clean Water Initiative that Claire's involved with. These are all great lobbying efforts, and there's our buddy Remy, right in the middle of it, as usual, sometimes playing both sides. If you watch the first season all the way through, the last two episodes, we see Tusk, Gerald Grady's character, the businessman's role, in vetting Frank as a vice president, is also about rent-seeking, right? He tries to get from Frank the blank check. Right, he says to Frank, if I tell the president that you're the right choice, that basically means you're going to do what I want you to do. And Frank tells him, hell. What Tusk says to him is, I have something you want, you have something I want. Right? That's the exchange. Okay? And those kinds of exchanges happen all the time. All of the expenditures around all of the attempts, the sweet talk politicians, all the limos, all the parties where the real business gets done, are all part of these rent-seeking ways. Okay? So what does this lead us, how does this get back to comparative political economy? Well, I want to say a couple things here. Okay? Briefly, I want to note that in the marketplace, one of the advantages markets have is they have these institutional processes, these institutional features that enable people in the market to both figure out what the public wants and to learn from their mistakes. Okay? Prices, profits, and losses tell entrepreneurs, tell producers, have you done it right or wrong? The economist William Hunt once said, profits in a real market are proof of social service. That if you're making profits, you're providing value to people. The profits that Apple makes and the profits that Google makes are just the flip side of how much value you and I get out of them by using them. Right? We can include Nestea in here too, my delicious iced tea. Right? The profit they make on that, okay, is a reflection of the fact that I found it valuable. Or actually, that Matt and Jack found it valuable by it. Okay? So prices, profits, and losses. And I want to emphasize losses because we live in a time, certainly in the U.S., maybe less so here, when all of a sudden making losses became a terrible thing that we have to prevent people from doing by bailing them out and giving them all kinds of stuff. Right? Losses are important. As I said in my intro class the other morning, losses in the market are like putting your hand on a hot stove. Okay? That tells you, don't do that again. Okay? Whatever you were doing, stop. Take your hand off the hot stove. When you prevent firms from making losses, you prevent them from knowing when they're burning their hands, right? They continue to engage in value destroying and not value creating behavior, okay? And what I want to argue is there's no equivalently powerful process in politics. The feedback mechanisms of the political process don't have that immediacy, they don't provide that information, they don't provide the right kinds of incentives. Another way to ask this question is, why are the unintended consequences of self-interest in politics harmful, while in markets tend to be good? Okay? And this is the beginning, I think, of that answer. Political processes have structural features that lead them to fail more often than markets do. And more importantly, make it unable for them to know that they failed and to make adjustments. Because again, people screw up in markets all the time, but they find out quickly, and they watch prices or profits or losses change in ways that provide them information and incentives to correct that behavior. The incentive structure of politics works against the general interest. And let me talk about at least one of those features, what I mean by structural features. Think about a bill before Congress, before Parliament. Oftentimes, and the example I like to use of this is, let's say it's a road construction bill. We're going to spend multiple billions of dollars fixing roads and bridges. Now, it might be the case that fixing roads and bridges is a good thing, okay? But let's think about how that's going to be argued, what's going to happen as people argue over this bill, okay? One of the things we have to recognize is that the benefits of a lot of government programs have particular features about them. Right? So if we say, who's going to be the primary beneficiaries in the narrow sense of benefit of a big road construction? Who's going to benefit? That's the indirect benefit. Who's going to sort of benefit materially? Yeah, construction companies and people who make cement mixers, right? All the kind of folks who are going to see billions and billions of dollars of contracts to do this work. Okay? Now again, we might benefit too from having better roads. The question of it will be, is it worth it? Think on the cost side for a minute. Okay? Who bears the cost of this? Well, if we're going to spend billions of dollars, that has to be paid for somehow. Either government's got to cut something somewhere else, unlikely, though you guys better than we are at that. All right? What else can they do? They can raise taxes, which means we all pay a little bit more in taxes. Or they can borrow more, which means all of our borrowing costs go up. Okay? So ultimately, we pay the price for that larger benefit. But notice something, right? The benefits here are concentrated, visible, and short-run. If we pass this bill, okay, you can go out and see the road construction. First of all, two things. One, who's going to benefit? The construction companies. That's a small group of people who's going to benefit a lot, concentrated benefits. They're visible. I go out, I drive around, I see the people working on the road. Well, I see some people working on the road, I see half a dozen people with a flag sitting around. Okay, but they're visible, they're out there. Okay? And they tend to be short run, right? Right away, we pass it, we start seeing roads and bridges being constructed. And we go, wow, good thing we passed that bill. But think about the costs by contrast. The costs are dispersed, subtle, and long run. If it's an extra $2 or $10 in taxes for each of us, right? That's not much. Think about a smaller bill, like some bill to create a museum somewhere, right? It might cost us 2 pennies in taxes, okay? Suppose you think that's the dumbest idea ever, but your taxes only go up by 2 cents. Is it worth it to do anything? You're not going to go running to the hill and complain about it. You might not even think it's worth your time to send an email for a couple more cents worth of taxes. Right? They tend to be subtle. We don't always see the cost. If government has to borrow more to do this, right, then it's really subtle. Because what happens? Well, government borrows more. That crowds private borrowers out of the market a little bit. That means some company didn't get a loan that they might have otherwise got, which means they can't expand, or they can't stay in business. They have to lay off a couple employees or cut their wages, right? And those are costs. Those are the costs of this program. Yet we don't see those. Those tend to be subtle and less visible. And they tend to be longer run. They tend to unfold over time. And the problem, of course, is if now Parliament or Congress is debating this bill, okay, what does the testimony and lobbying look like? The construction companies and the related folks go, this is the greatest idea ever, right? They know they're going to benefit from it. Meanwhile, who's saying no? It's hard for the people who are harmed by this to say no. Oftentimes, the harm is very small. And oftentimes, they don't even know that they're going to be harmed by it. It's not like a worker could say, can go to Congress or Parliament and say, if you pass this bill, what's going to happen? Well, you're going to have to borrow more, and that means my company won't get a loan, and that means they're going to lay me off. You can't know that. It may well happen that that's how it works, but there's no way you can know that ahead of time. And so what happens is, that's the, what the politicians hear are the beneficiaries. They don't usually hear the people bearing the costs. And given that, right, it's pretty clear that it's going to tend, programs like this are going to tend to pass, even if they're not ideally in the public interest, even if people think it's a bad idea. Okay? Should we really fund that little museum for $1 million? No, it's stupid. Okay, but here you go. So again, this is a structural feature of politics that makes it difficult for the political process to serve the public interest. And that's why Remy's my favorite. Because not only, right, this is the second season picture now. I mean, not only is he a great character and he's interesting, he's a good actor, but Remy, who will do, he used to work for Frank, right? He was working one side, now he's working the other side. He's a mercenary, a very well-paid mercenary. What does he do? He tries to persuade people to do what his employer wants, right? He's a lobbyist, he's a persuader, okay? He's the one making these exchanges happen, okay? And so it's all this kind of spending that we're talking about here, right? That drives the political process that drives the growth of government. With the Frank Underwoods of the world constantly trying to please the Remys, the Claires, the presidents, the teachers' unions, his constituents, it's not surprising we see programs being proposed all the time. And this is why they keep passing and not going away. It's very difficult to cut the size of government for just these reasons. Because when you start to cut, in fact, when you start to cut, the costs become concentrated and visible in the short run, and the benefits become dispersed in the long run. This is why it's been so hard for places like this former Soviet Union to reform. Because shrinking the size of government works exactly the opposite way. It's very difficult. And what's interesting here is this is true no matter the intentions of the politicians. You can be the nicest guy in the world, you can be a complete bastard, right? Either way, you're facing these same structural features that generate these kinds of outcomes. Okay, so here's where we get it. Is all hope lost? I guess I didn't animate this. Is all hope lost? All right? Does public choice give us any reason, right, to think that anything good is going to happen here? One thing's true, it won't come from electing better people. All right? One of the things that public choice suggests to us is that worrying about who's in office is like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic. Okay? It's not the most helpful thing that you can do. Right? Again, how do we prevent bad people from doing bad things? We have to recognize that the powers we give people to possibly do good are the same powers that can do an awful lot of bad. We can think of a lot of good things we'd like government and political actors to do if only they had the power, right? But once you give them that power, that's the same power they can use to do bad things, whether intentionally or not. And so one question to think about is, given the structure of politics, should we be more confident that good things will happen or that bad things will happen? And this is where structural features, institutions and rules of the game come in, right? There are ways we can make it more difficult for politicians to do bad things, right? Balanced budget amendments in the US, for example, sunset provisions in all spending, that spending has to be renewed from ground zero every 2 years. Supermajorities for some or all spending. Suppose spending bills have to have a 2/3 or 3/4 majority, okay? And in the US, there's interesting debate going on among classical liberals about the role about whether or not the Constitution actually does or should constrain the kinds of things that government can do. You can think about, if you know a little bit about this, if there's any law students, the takings clause in the US Constitution and some of these other things that are being debated about the role of property rights in the Constitution. A whole bunch of interesting debates taking place there. So in the end, what public choice theory does, and what House of Cards does, is to de-romanticize politics. The power of House of Cards is it lays bare that ugly sausage making and lets us see it for what it really is. A process by which largely self-interested actors trade favors in order to redistribute wealth to their friends and supporters and themselves. Politics is about power, and ultimately it's about the trading of human beings. And unlike the market and the ways in which market trade in goods and services create wealth and improve lives, politics tends to make things worse. Shows like House of Cards, and now I'm going to tell you why. Shows like House of Cards can be part of an intellectual revolution that begins to say no to the problems of politics. But for that to happen, right, so if you think public choice theory, one of the things about talking about public choice theory can be really depressing, okay? Because now you're thinking, oh, this is terrible, how do we ever get out of this mess? Especially if you're someone sympathetic to limiting the size of government, right? You just look at this and go, oh, what do we do, okay? At the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to change the climate of ideas. And to do that, something like House of Cards can be helpful, because and it will be helpful. But to be helpful, viewers need to understand that what's being portrayed in House of Cards is not the exception, but the rule. House of Cards is what happens when governments are unconstrained. It might be an extreme example, but it's not that far away from reality. That show is not about the failure of people. It's not that Frank Underwood is a bad guy, though he might be. Okay? It's about the failure of ideas and institutions. It's about what can happen when you create these institutions of power, and once you do so, it's going to be the worst that get on top, to use a phrase from Hayek. Once power becomes the thing that's available and out there, people like Frank Underwood with, as we'd say in economics, a comparative advantage in seeking and using power will find a way to get it, and he does. Public choice theory helps us to understand this point. And in that way, it points to a way out of this world. It suggests that what we need is a revolution in ideas. A revolution in ideas that will help us understand why it's important to limit the kinds of power the government has. And if we can do that, and we can begin to change institutions, we can begin to make it much, much harder for the Frank Underwoods of the world to do their dastardly deeds. So thank you very much.